I think most ancient cultures have meter in their writings, mostly because old cultures were all oral. Writing is a relatively recent phenomenon. So if you had to transmit, texts over hundreds of years, and you had to memorize thousands of lines, then having a metrical pattern is what helps you do that. So I think so in fact, because of meter, between Anusha and I, we probably have maybe something like 10,000 verses memorized. And it's the meter that enables that. And it's scandalous even in this age. And I want to point out that this was not scandalous back in that age. I mean, we may have this idea that uh, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, people must have been less open than we are today. But that is not true in all contexts. Because if you go to a truly orthodox Pandit in India and you read out the verses in our book to them, they will not bat an eyelid because this is completely normal to them. In fact, it is only people who sit in the middle. So if you go to the extreme liberal, or not the extreme, the liberal in India, any liberal person in India, they will not have a problem in this book.
And Sanskrit just shows you how to do them beautifully. So just a book, for instance, whether you want to flirt, whether you want to break up, whether you're longing for someone who's far away, whether you're happily single and want to say something sarcastic about love. Sanskrit just offers you a very beautiful, polished way to do it. And as to the second part of your question about having the right idiom to speak Sanskrit in today, I think we would say for Sanskrit the same that we say for all other Indian languages as we grow and evolve and new things come up. So for instance, throughout high school, we were tortured with, like I told you, essays on population explosion and air pollution and all of these things in languages which don't have words for them in the first place, right? Like these were all invented words that we came up with to address the issue. So there, I think Sanskrit does offer an advantage in terms of its ability to coin new terms, which is already built into the language. So,
and in fact, Sanskrit poets do not write down what they consider as vulgar. So you will not find even one verse in Sanskrit literature where people thought this was vulgar, but we wrote it anyway. That is exceedingly rare.
हेलो सौरभ, भवान कथम अस्ति?
अरे बाप रे, आज तो बाउंसर दे दिया। एकदम बढ़िया है प्रणय। ख्याति, तुम बताओ, तुम कैसे हो?
मैं भी ठीक हूँ। वैसे ये ओपनिंग के बाद मैं कहूंगी कि हमने बहुत सारी भारतीय भाषाओं को तो डिस्कस किया है, लेकिन संस्कृत के बारे में और किसी भी भाषा में एक्चुअली हमने लिटरेचर के बारे में ज्यादा चर्चा नहीं की है। कभी किसी भी भाषा की कविताएं या उसके बारे में हमने बातें नहीं की है, तो क्यों ना आज उस त्रुटि को ठीक किया जाए।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल। और वैसे भी कविताओं में प्रेम कविताएं, उनके बारे में भी बात करनी चाहिए, क्योंकि वैसे प्रेम कविताओं के बारे में मेरा ज्ञान तो सिर्फ बॉलीवुड में ही शुरू होता है और खत्म हो जाता है। तो इंतजार, इकरार, इनकार और एतबार के अलावा मुझे ज्यादा कुछ नहीं आता। तो इसीलिए ये जान के मुझे बहुत ही मजा आया कि एक नई किताब आई है, हाउ टू लव इन संस्कृत, और इस किताब में संस्कृत की प्रेम कविताएं और संस्कृत और कुछ और भाषाओं की भी प्रेम कविताओं का उल्लेख किया है और फिर उसका अनुवाद किया है बहुत ही मॉडर्न तरीके में, जिसमें आप समझ सके आसानी से। तो बहुत ही मजा आया मुझे किताब पढ़ के। तो हम लोगों ने सोचा कि इसी किताब और संस्कृत के ऊपर एक पुलियाबाजी करें। तो हमारे साथ आज जुड़ रहे हैं इस किताब के लेखक अनुषा और सुहास, और दोनों संस्कृत में काफी पढ़ चुके हैं, और अनुषा तो उसमें पीएचडी भी कर रही हैं। तो हम लोगों ने सोचा उनसे ही समझते हैं इस भाषा की कहानी और इस भाषा में और क्या क्या लिखा जाता था हिस्टोरिकली, वो समझने के लिए। तो बहुत बहुत स्वागत है आपका अनुषा और सुहास पुलियाबाजी में।
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Namaste. So happy to be here with all of you.
तो शुरुआत से ही शुरू करते हैं। हम लोग यही जानना चाहते हैं, पहले तो संस्कृत भाषा में से आपका लगाव कैसे हुआ? हाउ डिड यू फॉल इन लव विद संस्कृत?
So Pranay, I think for me it was probably in high school. All of us take up Sanskrit in high school, but we also see that we have these translations and maybe excerpts that are less than ideal, very Victorian, and it leaves you not just bored but also bewildered most often. You're not really sure what people are getting at. Uh, but when I was in high school, our textbook in Bangalore was such that it had excerpts from all the great poets. So it was complete undiluted material. And I could see somewhere that this was extraordinary, that these people were really playing it with language at a level, playing with its texture, with its sound, at a level that I did not see in say English or in Kannada, in Hindi. And I recognized that, and I think that's what led me to keep going at it. But I must say that the traditional translations and the mode that it was taught in did not help the process. It makes it more difficult than it actually is.
तो आपको जनरली कविताओं में रुचि थी, तो इसलिए आप देख रहे थे कि भाई अंग्रेजी की ऐसी हैं कविताएं या कन्नड़ा की ऐसी हैं, पर संस्कृत में ऐसी क्यों नहीं है, इस तरीके से सर्च शुरू हुई, या जनरली और कोई प्रोसेस रहा कि लैंग्वेज में इंटरेस्ट था इसीलिए लैंग्वेज की कविताओं में इंटरेस्ट आया?
I was generally interested in poetry, but I could see that in Sanskrit it was special. It was for instance, the meter in Sanskrit is very exact in a way that it's not in English. And I could also see that this was a very, very sophisticated culture. So when Banabhatta in Kadambari writes one word which stretches across maybe two lines, you can see that this is not the product of an ordinary language. This is a product of a very carefully crafted literary culture. And that's what drew me in. And also, if you look at textbooks today, say English or Hindi or Kannada, the material is pretty diluted. So in English, we had lessons on things like rainwater harvesting or global warming. I don't want to sit in an English class and learn about global warming. I actually want to read fine literature that was maybe written by Milton or by V.S. Naipaul, somebody like that. So I think our education system failed for most languages, but for Sanskrit, because we had access to the undiluted material, for those who had interest, it worked.
Yeah, I guess
ये
my interest began too with reading a text like the Raghuvamsha, which is so gorgeous, and the meter of it is so attractive. And yet, so like Suhas said, the translations are so diluted and boring at one point that they can actually put you off the text. So our interest began in high school too, and I think it only got better as we met more and more people involved in actually writing in Sanskrit, speaking in Sanskrit, working on ancient Sanskrit literature. So I think having a community of other people who are also reading helps. So Suhas and I began by reading the Panchatantra together. That was the first text we read from cover to cover. And you'll be surprised how many pleasant surprises there are in a text like the Panchatantra, which you assume is for kids, but it's really not. So
आपने ये तो मैं बाद में पूछने वाला था, लेकिन आप दोनों ने शुरू में ही मीटर की बात करी कि संस्कृत में मीटर कितना इम्पोर्टेंट होता है, तो इस बारे में कुछ बताइए ना। इसमें संस्कृत काफी अलग है बाकी भाषाओं से। हर भाषा में राइमिंग ज्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट होती है, ज्यादा नहीं बोलना चाहिए, मीटर एंड राइम दोनों होते हैं, लेकिन संस्कृत में जितना मुझे आप ज्यादा समझाएंगे, लेकिन शायद राइमिंग का तो कल्चर है ही नहीं, मीटर का ही कल्चर है, ये कहना ठीक होगा?
तो थोड़ा मैं ट्रांसलेट कर दूं। राइम मतलब तुकबंदी, और मीटर मतलब क्या होता है सौरभ? मुझे नहीं मालूम।
जैसे हाँ, मीटर मतलब क्या होता है,
छंद।
जैसे हाँ, छंद बोल सकते हैं।
अच्छा, ठीक है, ओके।
हाँ, तो बताइए।
So this is a really good observation that you've made, that Sanskrit does not have rhyme. It only has meter, which I think I should explain a little bit more. So when I say Sanskrit does not have rhyme, what we mean is that Sanskrit does not have end rhyme. So we most languages today, we are used to seeing end rhyme. So the rhyme occurs at the end of the sentence. But in Sanskrit, rhyme does not usually occur at the end of a sentence, but it occurs within sentences. And in fact, there is even this thing called yamaka, roughly doubling, where entire lines can rhyme. So what I mean by that is, for instance, there's there's this one verse that I think Magha writes, which the entire verse is 4 lines. All poetry in Sanskrit is 4 lines. So the verse is Vikasha miyur jagati shamargana, Vikasha miyur jagati shamargana, Vikasha miyur jagati shamargana, Vikasha miyur jagati shamargana. So you can see all the 4 lines are the same. In some sense,
Same.
it's a big rhyme. It's a huge rhyme.
Right.
But if you split the words differently, then the entire poem makes sense. So, but it also to say that so rhyme is found aplenty. There are also instances where you find end rhyme. But one of the reasons why you don't really see end rhyme all that often is because in Sanskrit, when poets write, they feel that having end rhyme tends to be distracting. It takes away from the gravitas of the verse. So you will see rhymes in plenty when it comes to things like stotras, which are meant to be chanted. And maybe and it really puts you into this trance kind of state, and the meters and the rhymes you use for those are different. But when you have serious poetry, the sort that's in our book, you avoid some of those things because it feels a little bit maybe childish.
Got it. तो लेकिन और आई थिंक ये मेरे ख्याल से मॉडर्न खासकर जो पढ़ने वाले हैं उनको काफी होता है, जैसे खासकर जैसे प्रणय ने बोला, हम सब लोग तो ज्यादा हिंदी मूवीज और ये सब देख के, या फिर गजलें बड़ी पॉपुलर है तो जिसको गजल में काफिया बोलते हैं, वो एंड राइम जिसको बोलते हैं, राइट, कि एंड में ये किया होगा या गया व्हाटएवर, राइट, कोई एक वर्ड होगा जिससे एंड हो रहा होगा। राइमिंग क्या, उसमें तो सेम ही वर्ड होता है, लेकिन गजल में एटलीस्ट मुझे पता है वो रदीफ बोलते हैं प्रणय, जो उसकी वो होती है एक मीटर, अलग अलग मीटर की गजलें होती हैं जिसको जैसे बोलते हैं, राइट। तो लेकिन ये चीज क्यों अलग है सुहास? मेरे को एक ये रुचि थी कि ये काफी यूनिक चीज है संस्कृत की, और कहते हैं राइट कि वाल्मीकि ने जो पहला श्लोक बोला वो पहली बार वो एक जो मीटर में उन्होंने बोला, वो क्रॉन्च वाला जो श्लोक है उनका, तो वो उन्होंने एक मीटर में, तो वो पहला, तो वो एक हिंदुस्तान में क्यों और हिंदुस्तान से बाहर क्यों नहीं हुआ? और इवन हिंदुस्तान में भी मॉडर्न लैंग्वेजेस में नहीं है ऐसा। आपने तो 4-5 भाषाओं का यूज किया है आपकी बुक में, अपभ्रंशा भी है, प्राकृत भी है, पाली भी है, तो ये कल्चर जो है संस्कृत का, ये परवेसिव है हिंदुस्तानी बाकी लैंग्वेजेस में सीप इन क्यों नहीं हुआ? इनफैक्ट मुझे बोलना चाहिए है ही नहीं, क्योंकि बाकी जगहों पे तो फ्री वर्ड्स को माना जाता है चीटिंग कर रहा है ना कभी, कि भाई आपने क्या कहते हैं फ्री वर्ड्स कर दिया तो ठीक है, आप मतलब पे ज्यादा कर रहे हैं, लेकिन मीटर में तो खैर चीटिंग बिल्कुल नहीं कर सकते। आपने जैसा बोला संस्कृत का मीटर तो बहुत स्ट्रिक्ट होता है, तो ये क्या है चक्कर?
ऐसे सौरभ मैं जोड़ दूं कि जापानीज पोएट्री में मीटर बहुत स्ट्रांग रहता है, राइट, उसमें बहुत सारे टाइप की रहती है ना, हाइकू मतलब वो कि इस फॉर्मेट की पोएट्री जिसमें मीटर
ही है
इस
सिर्फ।
प्रकार है, और थिंक चाइनीज पोएट्री में भी मीटर बहुत
ज्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट है। हाँ चलिए, तो हम देखिए सिर्फ हम हिंदी मूवीज के नौसिखी है ना।
सॉरी, सुहास और अनुषा प्लीज go ahead.
I think I'll let Suhas take this because he's particularly interested in meter, and but I can just say that all ancient languages have meter as a very important part of their poetry. So if you look at Greek, Latin, which Suhas can speak
they are
more,
also got it,
then you would find something similar. And you'd also be surprised to see meter actually hiding even in things like Bollywood music. So if you find something particularly striking, it's possible there was actually some resemblance to a meter at the very least there.
Yeah, I mean, as Anusha said, a lot of, I think most ancient cultures have meter in their writings, mostly because old cultures were all oral. Writing is a relatively recent phenomenon. So if you had to transmit texts over hundreds of years, and you had to memorize thousands of lines, then having a metrical pattern is what helps you do that. So I think so in fact, because of meter, between Anusha and I, we probably have maybe something like 10,000 verses memorized. And it's the meter that enables that. And in the meter that we know, if we listen to a certain verse, if we hear it 3 times, we can probably just memorize it immediately. And there are people who can hear it once and just memorize it. So meter is a very, very powerful thing. But I mean, to get back to the question that Saurabh was asking, I think it's the emphasis that the Indian tradition gives on orality that really enables this whole thing. So there is a saying in Sanskrit that says, Pustakasthatu ya vidya, parahasta gatam dhanam karyakale samutpanne nasa vidya na tadhanam. So the knowledge that's in a book, pustakasta tu ya vidya, and parahasta gatam dhanam, and money that you've loaned to somebody else or you've given to somebody else. When you actually want to do something with it, it's actually of no use. So if the knowledge is in a book, it has to be in your head. I know. I mean, it's trendy these days to say that don't
Rote learning
memorize.
is terrible.
Rote learning is bad. But I am all for rote learning, because if you have rote learned all the equations, so I'm a physicist. So if you've rote learned all the equations that you need to know, all the solutions to differential equations, you can just crank them out. You don't have to go back and search, look at tables again and again to see how the solution is done.
आप एक अच्छे LLM बन जाओगे फिर.
Yeah, that's the hope. Yeah.
ठीक.
तो आपने अपनी किताब के लिए एक बहुत ही लंबे टाइम पीरियड से किताबें कविताएं चुनी है, तो थोड़ा सा इस लंबे टाइम स्केल के समय में ये सारी भाषाएं आपने संस्कृत, प्राकृत, अपभ्रंश और पाली की भी कविताओं में से कविताएं चुनी है, तो थोड़ा सा इस समय काल में इन भाषाओं के साथ क्या हो रहा था, किस प्रकार का साहित्य लिखा जा रहा था इन भाषाओं में, थोड़ा उसके ऊपर एक ओवरव्यू देंगे तो.
Sure. So this whole range of languages are all related, and if we look at them, we can see all kinds of literature. So so Sanskrit, of course, was also the language of Shastra, which means to say any kind of philosophical debate. You can find people conducting through the medium of Sanskrit, whether you have treatises on medicine, whether they're on architecture, whether they're on temple construction, whether they're on whether they're jokes. You can find them all in Sanskrit and these other languages. So they are also, of course, the languages of religion. So you can find say Buddhists and Brahmins and Jains debating in Sanskrit about their doctrine. So it was a very vibrant set of languages that you see were being used regularly in various different contexts by all the by all of society. So there was no one particular use for them or one particular function that they were fulfilling. They were as alive as the languages you and I speak today. So yeah, there's a whole wealth of them, and there is so much yet left to be discovered that we don't even have access to.
I also wanted to add here about what these languages were actually doing in society. So I think people often fail to realize that the history of Indian literary languages, so Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Apabhramsha, they are all dead languages that were resurrected to function as literary languages. So that means that for the vast majority of Indian history, when Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, Apabhramsha were in use, actually nobody spoke these languages in kitchens or in bedrooms. People knew how to speak them, but nobody spoke them in kitchens or bedrooms. And people often have this impression that Sanskrit was the language that was spoken by elites or was used by elites, and Prakrit was this language that was spoken on the streets. But this is not true, because actually Prakrit, for the vast majority of its existence that we have as a literary language, nobody spoke it, because language had evolved beyond the stage of Prakrit. It was then Apabhramsha. And then Apabhramsha also stopped being spoken and it was used as a literary language. So so when we see these writers in our book who are writing in Prakrit, this is not a language of the streets. This is a highly cultivated language that was again being written by elites, and this was a dead language at that point. By dead, I'm not diminishing the language. I just mean to say that it was a cultured
Not
language.
common use.
तो जैसे
And
आपकी
this is,
sorry,
go ahead,
ahead.
Anusha.
I was just saying, this is something that we've got some pushback against, for saying, you're saying how to love in Sanskrit, but then you're kind of pushing behind these other languages that you've used, which were actually the language of the common people, so to speak. So that's something interesting to know, that Prakrit is actually not a kind of lowly language, while Sanskrit is lording it over. In fact, Prakrit is famous as the language of love, as the language of this kind of highly cultivated poetry. And all the Sanskrit poets and authors and writers on rhetoric are actually referring back to Prakrit poetry and this collection called the Gatha Saptashati or Gaha Saptasai, particularly, and looking back at it and admiring it and quoting it over and over again. So as we've also said in the introduction, just because the speaker in the poem is a village girl, it's a mistake to assume that the author is a girl in the village writing it. It's usually some highly learned poet at a king's court somewhere writing to impress the king or someone else. But you can't draw such parallels back to the speaker in the poem and the author of the poem easily in Sanskrit, Prakrit, or any of these other languages.
आपने जिस वर्क के बारे में अभी जो रेफरेंस दिया 700 गाहास, जिसका टाइम फ्रेम इफ आई एम नॉट रॉन्ग 100 सीई था, राइट? सो क्या उस समय भी प्राकृत बोली नहीं जा रही थी? क्योंकि मुझे लगा कि शायद उस समय तो प्रोबेबली शायद वहाँ उस स्ट्रीट की भाषा होगी, ऐसा मेरा अनुमान था. तो आपका क्या इसके बारे में कहना है?
It is possible. So the data is not very clear on this, but it's possible that at the time that Gaha Satyasai 700 Gahas was composed, Maharashtri Prakrit or some form of it was actually being spoken on the streets, but not far after that. So for instance, in Kalidasa, who comes maybe 300 years afterwards, we see in some of his plays we see some Apabhramsha verses. So what do we gather from that? Either that Kalidasa's time we had Apabhramsha, or that this was later inserted into his verses, into his plays, because plays it's a performance, right? So you want to have material that's being spoken on the street. So maybe somebody introduced it into the play later, but it's quite likely that around the time of the Satyasai, Prakrit was in the form that in that form was spoken on the streets.
इससे क्योंकि हम लोग डेट्स की बात करें तो जैसे आपने कहा 100 ईसा के बाद जो टाइम है उस टाइम पे गाहा सप्तशती लिखी गई थी. तो ये हम लोग को टाइम कैसे पता पड़ता है? क्योंकि जैसे क्योंकि आप जैसे कह रहे लिखा नहीं गया था तब, तो कई सदियों तक तो ये ओरली ट्रांसमिट हुआ होगा. तो हम लोग डेट्स कैसे देते हैं ये भी मुझे समझना था, क्योंकि जैसे हम लोग अर्थशास्त्र के बारे में भी कहते हैं. अब अर्थशास्त्र हमें पता है, जो अभी हम लोगों को जो भी ज्ञान है वो जो श्याम शास्त्री ने मैसूर में उनको मिली थी एक उसकी मैन्यूस्क्रिप्ट, उससे पता है. और वो मैन्यूस्क्रिप्ट भी शायद 14-15 सदी तक की थी, 14-15 सेंचुरी की. लेकिन हमें पता है अर्थशास्त्र तो कई सेंचुरीज पहले लिखा गया था. तो ये डेट्स कैसे पता पड़ती है संस्कृत लिटरेचर की हमें?
Now, this is a very great question and a very difficult one to answer, because if you open any Sanskrit text and you look at the introduction, most commonly within the first paragraph, you will see a sentence of something that says something like, we know nothing about the author's date or place, or something like that. It's very, very difficult to know when these authors lived. But
I mean, even major figures like Kalidasa, we have no idea when they really lived. We just have a very rough estimate, and like 3 different scholars will give you 3 different dates, which are centuries apart, and it's impossible to know which is the closest. So that's a real complication. But one of the ways that we know is by seeing later authors who cite earlier authors. So if you see a text from the 11th century or several texts from the 11th century citing someone, then you know they came before. And that's one of them.
Specifically in the case of the Gatha Saptashati, which you just mentioned, so it turns out that the author of this is said to be a certain King Hala, who was of the Satavahana dynasty. So at the very start of the work, there's a verse that says that so King Hala, after examining 1 crore verses, presumably produced by poets in his kingdom, he chose the best 700 and then he compiled them into this verse. So Halena Viratiyaim Salankarana Gahana. So that's what the work says at the start. So the Hala was of the Satavahana dynasty. So we have some way to date when Hala lived. So assuming that Hala actually compiled this, we know approximately when the date was.
तो मतलब ट्रायंगुलेशन का काम है थोड़ा, ऐसे ही डायरेक्टली किसी में नहीं लिखा हुआ है कि मैं आज ऐसे डायरी में डेट लिखते हैं वैसे किसी ने नहीं लिखा है
very rare. So that does happen sometimes. So right now I'm translating a text for the Murti series called Neelakantha Vijayachampu, which is one of those rare texts where he actually exactly gives us a date, saying I composed it in this year. And that is such a happy occurrence because it never happens. The Jains are good at this. The Jains very often give you an exact date, but the Hindus and the Buddhists are very bad at this.
सुहास, जैसे आपने की कहा जैन मंक्स के बारे में, तो ये मुझे बड़ा अचरज हुआ जान के कि जैन मंक्स और बुद्धिस्ट मंक्स लव पोएट्री लिख रहे हैं, ये कैसे हो गया और ये क्यों कैसे हो गया, तो कुछ उसके बारे में बताइए हमें.
Yeah, I mean, to us living in this era, this may sound strange that a monk is engaging with love poetry, but it was not strange back then. So one of the big collections, the biggest and the best collections of Sanskrit poetry called Subhashita Ratnakosha was edited by a Buddhist monk called Vidyakara, who lived somewhere in the east, somewhere close to Nalanda. And we have many examples of Jain monks, Hindu monks, Buddhist monks writing love poetry, collecting love poetry. And I think the reason for this is that the literary culture and the religious culture were somewhat distinct. So you could engage in one without it affecting the other. And in Sanskrit, one of the śṛṅgāra rasā is called as rasa raja. So it's considered as the most important rasa. And if you look at these collections of Sanskrit verses, 40% of them are usually love poetry. And because these monks were also involved, they were also producing literature. They did not shy away from doing this, and it was considered acceptable to keep these two spheres of their life separate.
I also think that one of the important features of Sanskrit aesthetics is that you should be able to inhabit the persona of someone else. You should be able to feel as they did, or because of the concept of rasa itself, which is something universal. There is no restriction against someone experiencing śṛṅgāra as a rasa, because it's a universal kind of aesthetic experience rather than something individual. So I think this helps because you have male poets writing as women, you have female poets writing as men, and you can have someone else writing as a village girl, you can have someone writing as an emperor. So the idea is that you're completely able to inhabit their persona and feel as they would, and to elevate the kind of emotion they feel to the level of rasa, which is what makes something poetry in the first place. So because of this, I think it's easy to switch, because you're not really, I mean, a monk does not need to be in love to write about, to write love poetry. They only need to experience the śṛṅgāra rasa, which anyone can do at any time. And I think this helps the range of love poetry we find by monks or other religious figures.
ये आपने इंटरेस्टिंग बोला, और आपने जैसे पहला भी बोला था कि मतलब कोई हो सकता है कि बूढ़ा कवि एक छोटी बच्ची की तरह से बोल रहा हो वगैरह. जैसे आजकल क्योंकि हमारा सेंस होता है कि कविता जो एक हमारे इमोशन को एक्सप्रेस करने की चीज है, लेकिन जो जैसे एंशिएंट टाइम में आप कह रहे हैं वो एक कला है, जनरली एक आर्ट है जिसको आप प्रैक्टिस कर रहे हैं, और उस आर्ट को आप अलग अलग तरह से प्रैक्टिस कर सकते हैं, और आप करना भी चाहेंगे ना, कि आप ये नहीं है कि आप सिर्फ एक ही तरह से करेंगे. तो आप एक आर्टिस्ट हैं बेसिकली, तो आप बोलेंगे मैं आर्टिस्ट हूं, मैं ये भी करके दिखा सकता हूं, मैं ये भी कर सकता हूं. और देयर इज क्राफ्ट आल्सो, ऑब्वियसली संस्कृत पोएट्री में आर्ट भी है और क्राफ्ट भी है. तो आप अपनी आर्ट और क्राफ्ट अलग अलग तरह से दिखाएंगे. ये तो पोएट्री एक कला है, ना कि एक जस्ट मीडियम ऑफ एक्सप्रेशन जो आजकल हर एक को सिखाते रहते हैं कि ये तो फिर बस मीडियम, तुम अपनी भावनाएं जो है ऐसे बता सकते हो, वैसे बता सकते हो. तो ये बहुत अच्छा फर्क है. हाँ,
Absolutely, you're right. In fact, this reminds me of something that Stephen Fry says in one of his books. He says, when someone is learning music or some other skill, some other art, you never tell them, say, just sit down next to the guitar and pour out your feelings. I mean, everyone knows you can't do that. No one will want to listen to it. But only when it comes to poetry, for some reason, we tell everyone you just have to sit down with a paper and pen and pour out your feelings. So obviously, as he says, what results there too is not really cultivated art. So Sanskrit poetry as a cultivated art requires more work and practice and handling various meters with deftness, thinking of new ideas, or thinking of ways of recycling old ideas to become new.
इसीलिए आपने, मुझे अब समझ में आ रहा, आप कह रहे हैं कि वो संस्कृत पोएट्री इतनी एलिवेटेड है क्योंकि वो आर्ट है और आर्टिस्ट एक दूसरे को इम्प्रेस करने के लिए ये कर रहे हैं। आप सिर्फ अपनी फीलिंग करते रहेंगे तो ठीक है, आप फीलिंग निकल के आएगी और एक लेवल पे आके आप रुक जाएंगे, लेकिन वो जो एक कला की निपुणता है वो तो ओवर टाइम बनती है ना, जहाँ पे आप एक एक्सीलेंस बना रहे हैं, क्राफ्ट में एक्सीलेंस बना रहे हैं कि भाई मैं ये ऐसा भी कर सकता हूँ या वैसे भी कर सकता हूँ। क्या ये इसीलिए भी थोड़ा सा है कि कविता हमारे यहाँ नाट्य से निकल के आई, तो उसमें तो एनीवे डिफरेंट कैरेक्टर्स होने चाहिए, तो आपको हर कैरेक्टर के मुंह से बोलना ही पड़ेगा ना, आप एक ही भाव से तो बोल ही नहीं सकते। बहुत ही बड़ा एजम्पशन है, क्योंकि रामायण पहली कविता बोलते हैं, पर रामायण काव्य काव्य है, लेकिन एक कहानी है जिसमें अलग अलग कैरेक्टर्स हैं। तो कहानी में कैरेक्टर्स होते हैं, तो उसका इसमें कोई असर आ गया, या क्योंकि ये नहीं है कि सिर्फ मैंने ये सोचा एक भाव की कविता नहीं है। आजकल जो इवन मॉडर्न हिंदी पोएट्री काफी बड़ी भाव की कविता होती है ना, कि मैं एक लिख रहा हूं तो कुछ किसी आइडिया के बारे में, या कोई एक मैसेज कन्वे करने के बारे में, या कोई एक इमोशन कन्वे करने के बारे में। लेकिन यहाँ पे एक कहानी कन्वे कर रहे हैं और उसमें इतने सारे कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी है और उसको मैं काव्य फॉर्म में कर रहा हूँ, तो ये एक अलग तरीके की चीज है। और सोचिए जो पहला ही महाकाव्य है वो इस तरीके का है, तो मतलब क्या उसने ऐसी टोन सेट कर दी कि भाई अब ये बेंचमार्क है, अब बाकियों को ऐसे ही करना पड़ेगा।
You're absolutely right. Yeah, definitely in that way, the Ramayana has set the tone for so much of Sanskrit poetry to come. And in my personal view, lots of Sanskrit poetry does not meet this great standard that the Ramayana sets, that whether you see Sita's character or Lakshmana's or Rama's, they're all crafted so beautifully in terms of their lines and their unique ways of thinking shining through. I think that really sets the tone, and so many later poets, nearly every single Sanskrit poet who comes after has to pick up the threads of the Ramayana and try to make something new from it.
पहली बार आपकी राइटिंग से ही मैंने रामायण को एक लव स्टोरी की तरह देखना शुरू किया, मतलब अदरवाइज हम उसको अलग तरह से देखते हैं जनरली, तो और आपने उसमें काफी एक्सर्प्ट्स में और उधर बाकी जगहों पे भी आप लिखते हैं, तो कि भाई मतलब जो उसमें खासकर जो विरह है राम का कितने ब्यूटीफुली है, जो वो इमोशन है विरह का वगैरह, तो वो बिल्कुल आपने एक अलग उसकी नब्ज पकड़ी है।
और उससे ही मतलब मेरा जुड़ा हुआ सवाल था कि मतलब लव पोएट्री लिखी है संस्कृत में, और कुछ कुछ सेक्शंस में तो काफी स्कैंडलस पोएम्स भी है, जो कि आज के डेट में भी लोग स्कैंडलस मानेंगे उन्हें। लेकिन हम लोगों को जब सिखाया जाता है संस्कृत, तो उसको एक बहुत ही मतलब थोड़ी डिस्टेंट लैंग्वेज टाइप सिखाया जाता है, या तो हाँ भगवान की भाषा है, या फिर भाषा है जिसमें सिर्फ हाई मॉडर्निज्म या एक अलग टाइप सिर्फ फिलॉसफी हो सकती है। लेकिन इसमें ऐसा क्यों हो गया? आपको क्या लगता है कि क्यों हम लोग ये नहीं सीख पाए कि लव पोएट्री भी आम कन्वे हो, संस्कृत उसका भी एक माध्यम होता था, तो ऐसा क्यों हो गया? आपको क्या लगता है?
So I think it's largely the mindset of the teachers that we have in school, who think that children should not be exposed to these kinds of base thoughts. And the only thing that children should be learning about is various kinds of preachy
like
sayings,
essays on
like if you
population explosion.
or sayings like if you're humble, then vidya dadati vinayam vinayadhyati patrata, this kind of thing, which seems self-evident when you're that age and also very boring. But I mean, Pranay also said something about how it's scandalous even in this age. And I want to point out that this was not scandalous back in that age. I mean, we may have this idea that 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, people must have been less open than we are today. But that is not true in all contexts. Because if you go to a truly orthodox Pandit in India and you read out the verses in our book to them, they will not bat an eyelid because this is completely normal to them. In fact, it is only people who sit in the middle. So if you go to the extreme liberal, or not the extreme, the liberal in India, any liberal person in India, they will not have a problem in this book. You go to the extreme orthodox Pandit in India who only read Sanskrit, they too will not have a problem in this book. Totally normal. It's only the people stuck in the middle who may think that this is scandalous. And the standards for what is scandalous or vulgar were very different than what we consider today. So in fact, nothing in this book is considered vulgar or scandalous. And the standards for, and in fact, Sanskrit poets do not write down what they consider as vulgar. So you will not find even one verse in Sanskrit literature where people thought this was vulgar, but we wrote it anyway. That is exceedingly rare.
क्योंकि ये एक कल्टिवेटेड भाषा थी, तो मतलब तुम सोच रहे हो लिखने से पहले, तुम्हें बहुत ज्यादा तुमने अपने आप से थोड़ी सेंसरशिप भी करी होगी कि बाकी के लोग क्या सोचेंगे, क्या मेरी क्रिटिक होगी अगर मेरे दूसरे महान लेखक पढ़ेंगे, तो ऐसा कुछ आप पॉइंट कर रहे हो कि अगर उनको ऐसा लगेगा
राजा के दरबार में आपको पढ़ना है लिख के, तो एनीवे ट्रांसलेट शायद नहीं हो रही, तो राजा के दरबार में आप शायद ज्यादा स्कैंडलस तो नहीं हो सकते हैं वहां पे, मुझे ऐसा लगता है। तो आप जो बोलेंगे वो थोड़ी डेकोरम के साथ ही आपको बोलना पड़ेगा। तो जो भी हम पढ़ रहे हैं वो हमको आज स्कैंडलस लग रहा है, पर वो डेकोरम नहीं होगा उस समय का।
Yeah, absolutely. That was 100% considered acceptable.
I mean, the best example is the Gita Govinda of Jayadeva, which the story comes up later that when he wrote it, he himself was a bit scandalized because in it he has Krishna asking Radha, please place your feet on my head. So the story goes, the story of course made up later, goes that he himself was a bit scandalized at what he wrote and he thought, oh my God, I did something wrong. And I must have offended the gods. So let me strike out the sentence from my manuscript as I'm writing it. And he strikes it out. And then he goes to take his bath. And then when he comes back, Krishna himself came in Jayadeva's guise and he struck out the striking out. So he kept it intact. So the story goes that Krishna himself wanted that line in there where he asked Radha to place her feet on his head. So but the very fact that the story came out at some point tells us that at some point people questioned whether they should be scandalized by it, before which it was perfectly fine to say these things.
और गीत गोविंदम थोड़ा मिडिवियल टाइम की है, तो तब तक शायद वो सेंसिबिलिटीज, और आजकल तो ज्यादा हम जिसको भी थोड़ी मॉडर्न सेंसिबिलिटी थोड़ी विक्टोरियन एरा की है ना, तो हम सोचते हैं कि विक्टोरियन एरा की सेंसिबिलिटी हिंदुस्तान में आजकल लोग सोचते हैं कि हमारे पूर्वज ऐसा सोचते थे।
तो सुहास एंड अनुषा, आपने अपनी किताब के कलेक्शन के लिए इसका क्यूरेशन कैसे किया? आपने इतने सारी चीजें पढ़ी, उसमें से किस तरह आपने वो डिसीजन मेकिंग किया कि ये इस चीज को हम ट्रांसलेट करेंगे, ये एक अच्छी ट्रांसलेशन हो पाएगी कि नहीं हो पाएगी? और ट्रांसलेशन के प्रोसेस में भी आपको काफी सारे कॉम्प्रोमाइसेस और शायद डिसीजन मेकिंग लेना पड़ा होगा कि अच्छा इसको मैं इस तरह से ट्रांसलेट करूं कि इस तरह से करूं, कि अगर ये करेंगे तो ये होगा। तो थोड़ा ये प्रोसेस क्या था आपका, वो थोड़ा इसके बारे में बताएंगे?
Sure, yeah. That's a very interesting question because the curation was one of the most challenging aspects of our translation. So basically, at the very start, we decided what we would not include. We feel that translations which claim to carry the sound effect of the Sanskrit into English are just lying. Because as people who have experienced the sounds that the Sanskrit verse itself can give, there is no way you can translate it into English. So to give you just one instance, tara tara tarai re tai ruttarottara torutai ratarta tittiri rauti tire tire tarau tarau. This is a verse in Sanskrit. It makes complete sense. It's a pretty simple one. It's about a bird that's lamenting everywhere looking for its mate. And it uses only, as you heard, ra and ta. Now, try to translate this into English. It's going to be impossible for any honest translator to capture the sound effect of this. So one of the decisions we made at the start is that if the punch in the verse, in the poem, depends on a sound effect like this, which can't be carried over, then we just unfortunately have to keep it out of our collection. And so I think that removed a major part of the poetry, both some of which is truly wonderful, but it has to be experienced in the Sanskrit. And we wanted a reader who has no exposure to the Sanskrit to be able to appreciate the book on its own. But fortunately for us, there is still a major section of Sanskrit poetry which depends on a key idea to carry its meaning. So like any poem in our book, if you pick it up, it has one key punchline or one idea that carries the verse through. So if we found that that could be translated, then that's what we picked up. And so over time, we collected all of these verses, and then we sorted through them to see which we thought translates best. Some other verses in Sanskrit depend on alankaras like yamaka or shlesha, puns, to carry through on their meaning. So, for instance, there's a verse, Dranti drishte dvipayasmin asrigale parajite sayati harirutkarsham nashrigale parajite. So if you hear it, this is an instance of end rhyme, as we were talking about earlier. In fact, it repeats the same set of letters at the end, but it's actually saying something about a lion and how the lion is not great unless it can, unless it's decorated with the blood of the śṛṅgāra that it has killed. So verses like this simply don't translate very well. So this left out a huge portion of poems from our curation. And then as to our actual translation process, what we usually did was to sit separately, work on our own translations of a certain poem. And then we came back together, compared our translations. Sometimes we were really surprised to see we were reading a verse very differently. When both of us thought it was pretty commonplace, but then when we saw our translations, we realized that, for instance, one of us thought the speaker was a man while the other thought it was a woman. So then that led to some interesting discussions on what we had already assumed. And I think we ended up with a version of the translation that was neither his nor mine, but something we agreed on was better than it. So that was what we did for every poem in the collection.
आप लोगों ने सोचा क्या अनुषा कि मे बी आपको पॉडकास्ट करना चाहिए ना उसमें, क्योंकि इतनी ओरल मीडियम है पुरानी संस्कृत की कविताएं, तो जब आप बोलते हैं और हम जैसे नाड़ी लोग पढ़ते हैं तो हम तो सब उसका घालमेल कर देते हैं, हमें तो समझ में ही नहीं आता है ना, हम तो लेकिन आप जब उसको सुनाते हैं तो उसका मजा ही अलग है। तो आपकी लिखाई से ज्यादा सुनने में ज्यादा मजा आया ये कविताओं को।
Yeah. That's really cool to hear. Maybe we should consider more audio books. So have someone who can actually, who's more musical minded read them.
हाँ, वैसे आपके जो इंट्रोडक्शन में एक बहुत ही अच्छा आपने तुलना की थी। आपने लिखा है कि जैसे संस्कृत में जो कविता रहती है वो एक भारतीय शादी की तरह होती है, जिसमें सब कुछ केओस जैसा मचा रहता है, कौन दूल्हा है कौन दुल्हन है वो भी समझ में नहीं आता, और आपका टास्क ये था उस टाइप की चीजों को एक इंग्लिश वेडिंग में कन्वर्ट करे, जिसमें आप स्ट्रक्चर लेकर आए। पर आप जैसे कह रहे थे आपका उद्देश्य था कि कोई ऐसा इंसान जिसे संस्कृत का ज्ञान ना हो और उसे कविता का भी ज्ञान हो, उसे आप इंटरेस्ट कर पाए, तो वैसा व्यक्ति मैं हूँ। तो आपकी कविता ने तो मुझे तो बहुत मजा आया, तो वो उद्देश्य तो अचीव किया। उससे आगे मैं बढ़ना चाहता, जैसे आप अनुषा एक कविता कह रही थी, एक शिशुपाल वध में भी एक वो कविता है ना, मतलब एक सेंटेंस है इसमें द मुझे पता नहीं क्या है वो, लेकिन सिर्फ द का प्रयोग करके एक पूरा सेंटेंस बनाया है, और कई कई जगह पे वहां पे पैलिंड्रोम्स भी यूज किए हैं वगैरह वगैरह। तो ये कैसे होता है, मतलब सिर्फ द का प्रयोग करके आप एक कुछ चीज कैसे कह सकते हैं? मुझे तो अभी भी समझ में नहीं आया, तो इसका कुछ समझाइए ना हमें, कैसे हो रहा है ये?
Absolutely. So one of the amazing things about Sanskrit is the range of vocabulary, not just that exists, but that you can create. So everything has 100 synonyms because Sanskrit as a language itself is built for poetry of this kind. It has to be in meter, which means to say I might have a restriction where I need a word to say elephant, which is just 2 short syllables. And then I can't use the usual word. So then I would say something like gaja, which is just 2 short syllables. So just to say the word elephant, I might have over 100 different words, one of which describes its trunk. It might mean something with a trunk. Another thing might mean something that plucks lotuses, for instance. So I might have so many words for elephant. And similarly for the sun, for example, something with rays, something that rises in the morning, and so on. So I can create words in Sanskrit which fit my metrical requirements for literally anything. This is one feature that enables the kind of verbal acrobatics gymnastics that is possible in Sanskrit but not possible elsewhere. The other, I think, is sandhi. So like in the verse you said, if there's just the, then there might be various sandhis which you'll be familiar with in Hindi and other Indian languages as well. So you can hide the other sounds because they get lost in the sandhi. So that's another feature of Sanskrit which allows for it. I'm sure Suhas can think of a couple more.
Yeah, I mean, this entire genre is called Chitra Kavya in Sanskrit. So Chitra meaning sort of dazzling or strange, wonderful poetry. And it's a big genre in Sanskrit with people doing many, many wonderful things. So as you mentioned, this thing called Ekakshari, which this verse containing only Das and Shirupalavada. There is also Dyakshari, Triakshari, palindromes. There's an entire work called Raghava Pandaviya, which is which at once tells you the story of Ramayana and Mahabharata. If you split it one way, it's Ramayana. You split it the other way, it's Mahabharata.
Wow.
And right now,
Hmm.
I recently managed to get a manuscript from Chennai of an unpublished work. Nobody has published this work yet. It's called Chitra Bandha Ramayana. It's called Kankana Bandha Ramayana. It was written by some medieval poet called Krishnamurti. Now, the amazing thing about this work is that it is only one verse. So there is only one verse of 32 syllables in the work. And it tells you the whole story of the Ramayana. How do you do that in just 32 syllables? And that is because you take that verse, 32 syllables, and you move all the letters to the right, one at a time in a cyclic way. And then you get a new verse. And you can do this 32 times, right? You can move it 32 times before you get back the verse. Just move all the letters one to the right. You can get 32 verses in this way. You move each verse, each syllable back, and you can do that 32 times. So from one verse, you can generate 64 verses. And these 64 verses, if you put them together, they tell you the story of the Ramayana.
Wow. Jabardast.
So, but yeah, it's essentially these kinds of tricks that Anusha mentioned, where you can coin words, you can hide words in sandhis. It's the genius of Panini's grammar that enables all of this.
तो वो बेसिकली जो एक खासियत संस्कृत की बोली जाती है वाक्यों में नहीं है कि आप किसी भी चीज की अगर कहने को उसकी प्रॉपर्टी बता दें तो वो उसका नाम हो जाता है कि भाई अगर हम बोलें ये सूंड वाला तो वो हाथी को हम ऐसा बोल सकते हैं और सब समझ जाएंगे कि तुम तो हाथी के लिए बोल रहे हो, पर हम हिंदी में ऐसा नहीं बोलते. तो ये कहना ठीक होगा क्या इस तरह से? या मैं बोलूं कि कोई जो कुछ चल नहीं सकता ये पेड़ है फिर, राइट? तो अगर हम बोलें कि डिस्क्राइब कर दें कि भाई जो चल नहीं सकता एक ही जगह जड़ा हुआ है तो वो पेड़ हो गया. तो हम अगर और पेड़ की अलग अलग दूसरी भी है कि भाई हरा भरा है तो वो भी पेड़ है, तो हम एक ही चीज को अलग अलग तरह से डिस्क्राइब करते हैं तो वो उसके जेन्युइन नाम है. हमको वो पहले से अग्री करने की जरूरत नहीं है, पर सुनने वाला भी समझ जाएगा और बोलने वाला भी समझ जाएगा. ये कहना ठीक होगा सुहास?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, there are conventions, because if you just say something that does not move, there are lots of things in this world that do not move.
Of course.
Yeah, in
पत्थर
fact,
भी है और पेड़ भी,
that's the
पत्थर भी है
word.
और पेड़ भी है.
पहाड़ भी.
Yes, but actually aga is one of the words for a mountain because it doesn't
अच्छा, move. अच्छा.
so that's
Doesn't
agreed
move.
upon by convention. But
Okay.
other than that, so one of the words for a tree is padapa, something that drinks with its feet.
Feet.
So if you think about it, that's how it gets its water. So padapa is a tree. But then these become generic words for the tree at a later point. So you don't even think about them. And similarly for an elephant.
और जबकि हम इसको आई मीन रिलीजियस साइड में भी देखते हैं, वो विष्णु सहस्त्रनाम भी इसी तरह से आते हैं ना, 1000 तरह से भगवान को डिस्क्राइब कर रहे हैं, तो वो सब भगवान के नाम हो गए। पर एक तरह से आप उनकी वेरियस क्वालिटीज को हर नाम में डिस्क्राइब करते हैं। पर ये चीज सिर्फ भगवान के लिए नहीं है, आप पेड़ के लिए भी कर सकते हैं और पहाड़ के लिए भी कर सकते हैं और पत्थर के लिए भी कर सकते हैं। तो ये हम भूल जाते हैं कभी कभी, क्योंकि संस्कृत को इतना ज्यादा हम सिर्फ रिलीजियस चीज के साथ एसोसिएट करते हैं। पर ये लैंग्वेज की खासियत है, ये रिलीजन की या भगवान की खासियत नहीं है।
अनुषा एंड सुहास, आप जब ट्रांसलेशन कर रहे थे तो हर कविता की एक फ्लेवर भी होती है, राइट? बियॉन्ड हाउ इट इज, बियॉन्ड जस्ट द स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ द पोएम और ट्रांसलेशन, तो वो फ्लेवर आप लोगों ने कहीं कहीं पे काफी सारी, हम कह सकते हैं कि क्रिएटिव लिबर्टी लेके आपने उसको काफी सारे नए लिंगो का यूज करके आपने लिखा हुआ है। तो ये डिसीजन मेकिंग भी आपने किस तरह से किया कि कहाँ आपने सोचा कि हम थोड़ा और चेंज कर सकते हैं, कहीं हम शायद ओरिजिनल वर्क के ज्यादा पास रहें या कहीं दूर? तो ये एक डिसीजन कैसे ले पाए आप?
So I would say this decision has been made easy because of the tradition of Sanskrit aesthetics and like rhetorics. Because when you look at particularly famous poems, say something by Kalidasa, over many centuries, the greatest scholars, the greatest minds have agreed on what the main idea of the verse is. So there is ambiguity in terms of this kind of wordplay that we told you, this kind of word jugglery and so on. But there is usually no ambiguity about what the verse itself means. Even when the meaning is not stated, but something implied, like in some of our poems in the book. Even then, like a whole tradition of centuries of people have agreed this is the idea that he's trying to convey. So for us, it was a matter of maintaining that key idea without changing it. And we were happy to take liberties with the rest of it. So to impart the same flavor as we thought the original conveyed in English. I think it would be easier with an example, but maybe Suhas can.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So for instance, I'll give you an example. So in our book, there's a book, maybe it's called Don't Date an Academic or something like that. I don't exactly remember the name. But it's about how this wife is complaining that her husband is very busy because he is a lecturer or as a professor, and the semester has begun and he's busy teaching, he's busy reading his book, preparing his slides, and that he has no longer any time for her in the bedroom. And this is her complaint. It's about
Samagata hantati thirtya.
Yes, so that's the verse, Samagata hantati thirtya. And that verse, now we put this in a modern context of a university, like a professor, things like this. But what was the actual context of it? Now, the actual context of this is in a Gurukula. And in the Gurukula, there are certain days that are designated as holidays you're not supposed to study on those days. And there's a sort of a semester break kind of a thing.
Especially like sacred scripture. It's called Anadhyayana.
And studying on those days is absolutely forbidden. So there are Gurukulas in India still, and they still follow this. And this Dvitiya day in the Hindu calendar is the day on which the Anadhyayana ends, and then the study starts again. But if we spent time in the verse explaining, it's the Dvitiya, it's the second day of the fortnight and all of this, obviously nobody will get what is happening. So we had to convert it into modern context. And once you do that, it works. But we don't think that we are being disloyal to the verse. We're just making it easier for people to understand what's happening.
ये सही है।
मैं थोड़ा सा मतलब एज अ रीडर मैं थोड़ा सा फीडबैक आपको देना चाहती हूँ कि मैं बहुत ही इंटरेस्टेड हूँ कि मुझे ओरिजिनल वर्स, उसका एकदम लिटरल ट्रांसलेशन, and then how you read all of those bits and pieces, and then you at the end you translate it like the way you have done. I am very interested in knowing that process, and I don't know if you have the time and patience to do this, but I would be really interested in reading that process, because usse mujhe, I mean, I can now appreciate that the complexity in the context in which that person was writing, and maybe I can understand their time frame and their lives a bit more than what we can with just the poem. Right now I can appreciate the poem, but when you do this, I can appreciate the language, I can appreciate the words and like a lot more. Maybe it's a lit not for everyone, I understand. But yeah, maybe I would be keen to read that if you ever have the time to write that.
ये पॉडकास्ट का आइडिया है आपके लिए.
No, I mean, I love that idea. And I would love to see this. So yeah, maybe we will take this up at some point. But we do have one example of how we refit a verse somewhere in the introduction, I think in the section called Translators Workshop. So we've taken up this one verse called Netrendi Varini and explained how exactly step by step we arrive at the translation. So you can take a look at that.
तो एक ये डिस्कशन से मुझे एक पता पड़ गया कि कोई भी कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव थेसॉरस या डिक्शनरी बनाना संभव नहीं है संस्कृत के लिए. मतलब इतने सारे उसके सिनोनिम्स होंगे हर शब्द के, तो पता नहीं, मतलब एक हजार पेज के एक वर्ड हो जाएगा. लेकिन मैंने एक और नोटिस किया किताब में, आपने जैसे लिखा है कि मेघदूतम जो है उसने कई चीजों को प्रेरित किया है, और आपने लिखा है आज के कंटेक्स्ट में भी लोगों ने न्यूयॉर्क वगैरह में भी उसको अप्लाई किया है. तो इसके बारे में कुछ बताइए ना, क्या मतलब लोग क्या कर रहे हैं, न्यूयॉर्क के कंटेक्स्ट में रीइंटरप्रेट कर रहे हैं या क्या कर रहे हैं?
So, I mean, a lot of people don't know this, that there still exists a pretty vibrant tradition of writing in Sanskrit. I mean, this may not be first page news or even last page news, so people don't know about it, don't hear about it in the media, but there are lots and lots of people who are continuing to write this kind of poetry in Sanskrit. And of course, the Meghaduta being one of the most widely read Sanskrit poems, it has inspired many spin-offs over the centuries. And in recent years, people have written things, for instance, I know there's a verse that sends a bat to somebody. There's somebody who sends a crow to New, sends an aeroplane as a messenger to New Jersey. So there are people who are writing these kinds of work. I haven't personally read any of these not because I'm not interested to read them, because the copies are so hard to procure. They'll be published somewhere in India in some government institution, and then you need to supply a DD and then get it shipped over. And where will I get a DD from sitting in Toronto? So it's a little bit hard. But Sanskrit poetry these days has really opened up to modern themes. So not just poetry, but writing in general. So for instance, there's also a really nice book that was published in very simple Sanskrit a few years ago called Bhuvamanita Bhagavad Bhasha. So that is the language of the gods has to the earth. But this language of the gods is not Sanskrit, it is Hebrew. So it's the story of how Hebrew was revived after many hundreds of years of being a scriptural language, and then finally be made resurrected in Israel. So I think this probably resonated with the author who wanted to see some parallels in Sanskrit. So there's quite a lot of opening up happening in Sanskrit with the international themes now.
वाह, ये तो बड़ी दिलचस्प बात.
आपने सुहास बीच में मूर्ति लाइब्रेरी का भी के बारे में मेंशन किया था, और आप उनके लिए ट्रांसलेशन कर रहे हैं. तो उनका, क्योंकि आई मीन वो उन्होंने शुरू इसलिए की क्योंकि बहुत ज्यादा अनट्रांसलेटेड वर्क अभी भी हैं संस्कृत में. उसके बारे में कुछ बताइए ना. हम ऐसा सोचते हैं कि हाँ, हिंदुस्तान में तो हम संस्कृत के बहुत ज्यादा ज्ञाता भी हैं, और इतनी संस्कृत की चीजें हम लोग उनके ऊपर ध्यान क्यों नहीं देते. लेकिन बहुत सारी संस्कृत अभी भी की मैन्युस्क्रिप्ट्स अभी भी अनट्रांसलेटेड हैं. तो कुछ इस बारे में बताइए कि वो, आई मीन, एक तो ऐसा क्यों है और इसके बारे में क्या हो रहा है.
I mean, you will be shocked to hear about the number of manuscripts that exists in India. And the number is actually, it's very difficult to estimate, but a conservative estimate is 30 million manuscripts.
बाप रे, 3 करोड़. बाप रे.
Yes, so 3 crore manuscripts lying around in India. And this is just in well-known places, in well-known libraries. I'm sure that in every village there's going to be the trunks full of manuscripts that a family has put away somewhere in their attic because their grandfather left it to them, something like that. Of course, not all of these manuscripts are unique. There's going to be a lot of repetitions and probably hundreds of thousands of Bhagavad Gita manuscripts out there. But you can imagine what a massive task it is to even just catalog these, to know what's out there. So for instance, in Gujarat, in Koba, there's this huge library that's been set up called Koba Library. We're mostly dealing with Jain manuscripts, but they have done a fantastic job. It's a sea of manuscripts there, and they're just cataloging these manuscripts, figuring out what actually exists. But these kinds of centers need to be set up all across India, so we can figure out what these 30 million manuscripts actually contain. But once we know what's there, it's also the question of, can we translate them? Can we write commentaries on them? Can we actually figure out what they mean? And we don't have the manpower or the skill set to do this. We can, of course, you may think that every year in India, there may be many tens of thousands of people who get master's degrees in Sanskrit. But we must also remember that they all get these degrees in a very small number of subgenres. So for instance, grammar, Vedanta, or maybe poetry are the top three. But there's just so much more that we don't even think about today. So for instance, metallurgy, medicine, architecture, who's going to work with all these kinds of materials? So nobody even knows how to read metallurgical texts anymore, mathematical texts. It's a vanishing art. So it's difficult. We need to retrain a whole set of scholars who can do these things. And I think Murthy is one way to get started, but Murthy depends on existing scholarship. We need to train scholars who can deal with this vast genre of materials that an entire civilization produced. You can think of everything that a civilization was doing, it's all written down in Sanskrit somewhere. But we have lost the expertise in most of it now.
I think another common error is to assume that because someone knows Sanskrit, they know all of this. It's just like saying, I know English, so I can read like Suhas's physics textbook and understand it. But we tend to make that mistake with Sanskrit all the time. So people assume because we know Sanskrit, we can read all those texts on everything from metallurgy to philosophy. And actually, those are all disciplines in their own right that need someone to work on them who knows both the language as well as the subject itself.
Absolutely. And if you don't know the context, it can seriously lead you astray. So we were just talking about how you can coin words for things in Sanskrit. So for instance, in a metallurgy textbook, there would be something like, it may say something like, add a little bit of peacock feather or peacock blue to a compound. Now, this does not literally mean add a little bit of a peacock feather, because the peacock feather may be a compound that actually stands in for copper sulfate, which has the same color, the blue of a peacock's feather. So the context is very important, and you need to specialize in these sub-genres.
और हम जो है हमेशा से सोचते हैं, अरे ये संस्कृत के बहुत स्कॉलर हैं, तो उनसे हम जान लें कि क्या पहले का लिखा हुआ है। तो ये तो ठीक है। वैसे हम किसी से नहीं बोलेंगे कि इंग्लिश लिटरेचर आपको बहुत अच्छे से आता है, तो आप एरिस्टोटल की या मैथमेटिक्स की कोई चीज को ट्रांसलेट कर देना।
या फिर आप कोई मैंड्रिन हिस्टोरियन से जाके पूछे कि यार मेरे को तुमको तो आता है मैंड्रिन, तो तुम मुझे समझा दो मैंड्रिन जियोपॉलिटिक्स भी एक ही बात है। तो ये बड़ी दिलचस्प बात कही आप दोनों ने। और अनुषा, मैं आपसे ये सवाल पूछना चाहता था, क्योंकि आप एक बहुत शानदार कॉलम भी लिखती हैं डेक्कन हेरल्ड में, सैंस द सेक्रेड, और उसमें एक बड़ी दिलचस्प कहानी लिखी थी आपने जगन्नाथ पंडित राय के बारे में, जो कि आप कह रही थी कहानी किस तरीके से संस्कृत मुगल्स के टाइम पे भी एक एक्टिव भाषा थी, लोग उसके ऊपर कंपोज कर रहे थे वगैरह। तो उस टाइम पीरियड के बारे में बताइए ना, संस्कृत का क्या हो रहा था ड्यूरिंग द मुगल एरा।
So as I said in that column, even in the Mughal era, Sanskrit was a big deal. So you still have lots of writers writing in Sanskrit. They're sometimes using Sanskrit to write in praise of the Mughal kings. So we have poets in Akbar's time writing. We also have efforts to translate Sanskrit texts into Persian or into other languages to try to capture the essence of the Mahabharata, say someone like Dara Shikho commissioning a whole lot of translations and also being a scholar himself. And I think even in our book, we have some verses from a collection that dates to that time, don't we? Aurangzeb's time. Suhas, do you remember which that is?
Yes, so we have some verses, very beautiful verses from a work called Rasa Kalpadruma, which was commissioned by Aurangzeb's uncle Shaista Khan, who was the Subedar of Bengal. And the interesting thing is that Shaista Khan not only commissioned this work, but he also wrote 6 Sanskrit verses which are in this book.
Wow.
So Mughals were also engaging with Sanskrit at some level. And even more interesting is that the verse that we have quoted from this book in our book is called "Sharing is Caring." It's verse number 163. That Sanskrit verse is actually the translation of a Tamil verse, classical Tamil verse. So you can imagine the amount of exchange that was happening. So it has gone from Tamil into Sanskrit in a Mughal court. So it's clearly quite a lot of exchange of cultures happening here.
Yeah, I think even in the Vijayanagara period, if you look at the south, then you also have compositions. So there's one particular verse that is directed to, that is spoken to Krishna Devaraya. And so when he goes to battle with the Nizams, he's told that when they all die and go to heaven, the kind of confusion that ensues in heaven there is described in a verse. So we have so many Sanskrit verses lauding both Mughal emperors. Down in the south, we have the Vijayanagara Empire, the Nizams, and all of this exchange in languages, in poetry, with them commissioning Sanskrit works as well. And it just makes for a lot of fun, because it's you then have to see some genre changes too, because you're describing, say, some concept in the Mahabharata, but when you're translating it into a more Islamic idiom, then you have to change certain things.
And I mean, one may also expect, one may imagine that maybe in Akbar's court or in Jahangir's court, it was you would only find Persian poets, but that is not true, because there was also Sanskrit influence in their courts, because it's such a rich tradition, and it just found its way into the court. So there was this scholar called Kavindracharya Saraswati, who was a scholar of Sanskrit, a poet, and who had immense sort of influence in the Mughal court. And they say that he got the jizya tax repealed under certain circumstances, and they had a huge procession for him going to the court for that. And then we even have this work called Kavindra Chandrodaya, where all the scholars get together, hundreds of scholars, and they get together and they write verses in praise of Kavindracharya for all that he did for them at the Mughal court. These interactions are not very well documented yet. The texts are out there, but nobody has really written extensively about them. It's still work waiting to be done.
Interesting. Anusha, I wanted to ask you about आपकी जो कॉलम है उसमें आप काफी सारे संस्कृत से जुड़ी थीम्स को कंटेम्पररी इश्यूज को एनालाइज डिस्कस करने के लिए आप उसका इस्तेमाल करते हैं. तो आपके पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से संस्कृत जैसी भाषा का आज क्या रेलेवेंस है? क्या इसमें कोई वैल्यू है जो हम जो किसी को उसको सीखने के लिए टाइम स्पेंड करना चाहिए? व्हाट वुड यू से टू दैट? एंड सेकंड, क्या आपको लगता है कि जैसे हम काफ़ी बार हिंदी हमारी पुलियाबाजी में ये कोशिश है कि हम हिंदी में बहुत सारी थीम्स जो हिंदी में डिस्कस नहीं होती है हम उसे डिस्कस करें हिंदी में. तो हम भी काफ़ी सारी उसमें हमें काफ़ी दिक्कतें आती है. हम काफ़ी बार इंग्लिश के टेक्निकल टर्म्स यूज़ करने पे मजबूर हो जाते हैं. तो अगर संस्कृत को करंट कंटेक्स्ट में यूज़ करना है तो क्या आपको लगता है कि संस्कृत क्या इस तरह से अडेप्ट की जा सकती है? हाउ डू यू लुक एट इट?
So when you ask me about the relevance of Sanskrit, there's actually a verse in our book that I wanted to quote.
Yeah, sure.
So the general idea is, what is the punishment for the crime of being immune to the charms of love? And the answer is the crime itself is the punishment. So I think in the case of Sanskrit and so many other beautiful languages, we can apply the same thing. So the punishment for the crime of not knowing them is that you don't know them.
It is your loss.
So, yes. So as to the relevance of it, I would say that we're all human beings other than, having to earn our living. There are a lot of other things that we want to do. And Sanskrit just shows you how to do them beautifully. So just a book, for instance, whether you want to flirt, whether you want to break up, whether you're longing for someone who's far away, whether you're happily single and want to say something sarcastic about love. Sanskrit just offers you a very beautiful, polished way to do it. And as to the second part of your question about having the right idiom to speak Sanskrit in today, I think we would say for Sanskrit the same that we say for all other Indian languages as we grow and evolve and new things come up. So for instance, throughout high school, we were tortured with, like I told you, essays on population explosion and air pollution and all of these things in languages which don't have words for them in the first place, right? Like these were all invented words that we came up with to address the issue. So there, I think Sanskrit does offer an advantage in terms of its ability to coin new terms, which is already built into the language. So it allows us to expand on it into different genres and use new terms for things we didn't have already. So I would say it's very much possible, especially since in India we all of those of us who know Indian languages already have some vocabulary at our disposal. So why not? In fact, one of the things that got me interested in Sanskrit was this whole community of Sanskrit speakers around me and learning together. So I think it's very much doable if you're motivated.
Let me add something here. So, I mean, imagine you're a professional chef, but you say that I don't really want to go to the market and pick out my produce or ingredients myself, or I don't even care to look. Or you want to take care of your car, but you say I don't really care to open the hood and look what's there, so I can change the oil myself. And I think that's the situation that we have today with Indian art. So there are lots and lots of Bharatanatyam performers, Kuchipudi, Odisha. But the basis of all of this is finally in the Sanskrit text. It's in the Natya Shastra and the whole tradition of that. Similarly, classical music, whether it be Hindustani or Carnatic, it's all in. The tradition was born in Sanskrit and the texts are it's all in there. But today the practitioners have completely lost that connect, and that is the shame. So it just becomes it's become this thing where a student sees something the teacher does and then repeats it, but has no theoretical understanding of why it was structured that way or what are its connections to broader art. And I think connecting with Sanskrit is one way of being able to connect more deeply with all of these Indian art traditions, whether it be sculpture, painting, dance, music. It's all in Sanskrit. And I think any art performer will find plenty to learn from if they look towards Sanskrit.
And I feel like it's not just art. So since you brought up my column, I never have any difficulty connecting some Sanskrit text to current events because the links are there for everyone to see. So every week in Parliament, someone brings up some mythological character and accuses someone of being like the Kauravas or like Shurpanakha. And this kind of rhetoric keeps happening over and over again, whether we like it or not. As Indians, we think in the idiom of these texts. We think in the idiom of the Mahabharata and Ramayana. So I would say the only question is, are we doing so knowingly, or are we just going to let it be something that we've unconsciously absorbed without thinking about deeply? And if that's something you want to examine and you want to know for yourself, the kind of idioms that we've picked up, what is the source of those idioms, those ways of thinking, the Indian ways of thinking, then you would ultimately have to look back into texts like the Mahabharata, the Panchatantra. In fact, I think the Katha literature of India is very, it's sold short. We don't hear enough about it, if you ask me. the Panchatantra, I think, or the Hitopadesha makes a claim. Adhite ya idam nityam niti shastram shrunoti cha na parabhavam apnoti shakradapi kadachana. So anyone who hears or reads the Panchatantra regularly does not get defeated even by Indra, the king of the gods. So even if the gods were to wage war against you, your ability to strategize would be so good that you could beat Indra at his own game. So that is the kind of absolutely. Yes.
There is certainly a lot of humor actually in all of these love poems. Actually, there's like so many poems with so much of humor and सब ताने मार रहे एक दूसरे को and all of that, right? So it और आपकी जो कॉलम है, मतलब मैंने पढ़ी कुछ आपकी कॉलम्स और एक्चुअली मुझे काफी फ्रेश टेक लगा आपका, जिस तरह से आपने चीजों को देखा है. तो डेफिनेटली आई कैन सी व्हाट यू सेइंग, एंड आपका एक अलग ही पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है जो मुझे काफी अच्छा लगा. और मुझे सुहास की एक बात को रिप्लाई करना चाहती थी, जब उन्होंने बोला कि हमारे डांसेस और हमारे बहुत सारे क्लासिकल आर्ट्स में फाइनली उसके रूट्स संस्कृत में ही है. तो मैंने एक्चुअली बचपन में सीखा हुआ है भरतनाट्यम, एंड उसकी हम काफी सारी थियोरी में हम नाट्य शास्त्र के बारे में पढ़ते हैं और हम काफी सारे ये रस और अलग अलग प्रकार की नायिकाओं के बारे में पढ़ते हैं. ऑफ कोर्स उस टाइम पे हम थोड़ा पढ़ते हैं, बट नाउ दैट आई हैव रेड दीज पोएम्स, I can relate to it a bit more because I can connect the dots of what I learned then and what the poems are telling me now, and I can say, oh, this is this kind of a naika or something like that, right? So it's just appreciation of things that we have already there around us, but you just connect some dots because of these things. Yeah.
Humble brag by Khyati.
Sorry.
मुझे एक चीज पूछनी थी खत्म करने से, तो आपको कभी ऐसा लगता है, क्योंकि संस्कृत हम एकदम से ऐसा पढ़ तो नहीं रहे होते सारे लोग, लेकिन क्योंकि काफी फाउंडेशन है, जैसे आपने बोला कि इतना ईडियम तो हमारा वहीं से आता है, उन्हीं कहानियों से वगैरह, तो संस्कृत पोएट्री से खासकर आपको कोई ऐसी चीजें मॉडर्न गाने वाने सुन के लगता है कि देखो ये तार वहां से लेके आज तक है, या देर इज सम टेक्निक और देर इज सम क्लियर थॉट जो कि बड़ा यूनिकली इंडियन संस्कृत पोएट्री का है, लेकिन हम आम गानों और कविताओं में यूज करते हैं, पर हमको ये मालूम नहीं है कि ये वहां से आता है. ऐसा आपको कभी सुन के लगता है?
Yes, a whole lot. I would say, especially with like old Bollywood music. So if you're fans of Kishore Kumar, Mohammad Rafi, this kind of era, if you just listen to the music, which I often do, then everything starting with say something about the fire of separation, whether it's about the fire of viraha, or even just comparing the heroine's face to the moon, all of them, all these cliches, what we now consider cliches, were actually very original at some point, and they all come from Sanskrit. So and I would say also this obsession with longing in Bollywood cinema, right? You have all these scenes with heroes and heroines sitting before windows, and then it's raining. The idea that in the rain you tend to miss someone more, and rain is romantic, is actually there in Kalidasa himself. It's at the start of the Meghaduta, where he says, when you're already missing someone, the rain just makes it worse. That's actually Kalidasa saying it. So once you read some Sanskrit poetry and you go back to any of the music you listen to, whether it's other regional South Indian languages or Bollywood, I think you'd find a lot of connect. I think there was also a fight sequence in some Hindi movie, I don't remember which it was, which actually used a Sanskrit meter for its soundtrack.
Nice.
Maybe I should get back to you.
तो अब हम ऐसा चांद सा रोशन चेहरा और चौधरी का चांद अलग नजरिए से देखेंगे, और मेरा लाखों का सावन जाए, ठीक है? तो ये सब आपने बहुत मजा आया आज आप दोनों के साथ बात करके, अनुषा और सुहास, और मुझे पूरी उम्मीद है हमारे जो सुनने वाले श्रोता भी है एकदम संस्कृत को अलग तरह से सुनेंगे, और संस्कृत के साथ हम शायद अपनी आंध्र भाषा को भी अलग तरह से सुनेंगे आज की पुलियाबाजी के बाद. तो बहुत शुक्रिया, बहुत मजा आया आज की बातचीत में.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
Thank you so much.
Really good fun.
Thanks.